Hello there. Today I want to take a look at a Chardonnay from the Adelaide Hills. So this is Orlando's Lyndale Adelaide Hills Chardonnay from the 2021 vintage. Now, Orlando is an historic South Australian wine brand that experienced a resurrection in 2020. Its history goes back to somebody called Johann Gramp, who came to the Barossa Valley in 1847 and planted a vineyard at Rowland Flatt next to a stream called Jacob's Creek. He produced and sold his first wine in 1850. Now, by 1874, they had somewhere in the region of 80 hectares of vines, and Johann gave his son Gustav 44 hectares of vineyard, named the Orlando Vineyard, upon his marriage. So 1874 is often quoted as the foundation date for Orlando. Having said that, I don't think that the brand is actually registered until something like 1912, but clearly wines were being sold by the Gramp family, I presume under the Orlando name prior to that. Orlando is one of South Australia's 3 large wineries and stayed in family ownership until 1971. Now, during the period of the 50s and the 60s, Orlando were one of the most innovative wine producers in South Australia. They pretty much single-handedly popularised the style of cool fermented Riesling, and their Steingarten brand was very influential. The other technological advance they pioneered was the importation of pressure tanks to enable the production of tank fermented sparkling wine, to produce value for money sparkling wine, and their Barossa Pearl brand was an important one through the 60s and 70s. In 1971, the family sold the company to a group called Reckitt Colman. Now, Reckitt Colman in 1976 created an Australian wine brand that we pretty much all know, Jacob's Creek, and they held on to the company until 1988. In 1989, the company was purchased again. This time it was purchased by a French wine and spirits group, Pernod Ricard, and Pernod Ricard had the international distribution necessary to build the Jacob's Creek brand. In fact, Jacob's Creek, originally a brand of Orlando wine, came to be the primary brand, and actually Orlando was just put into abeyance. It wasn't being used, and some of the Orlando brands were actually sold under the Jacob's Creek name. So with the re-establishment by Pernod Ricard in 2020 of Orlando as a brand, we see the relaunch of a number of quite well-known wines. So Centenary Hill and Lawson's Shiraz were brands created in the late 80s and 1990s by Orlando, along with the Jacaranda Ridge Cabernet Sauvignon, for instance, from Coonawarra. I'm not aware, however, of Lyndale as an Adelaide Hills Chardonnay existing prior to 2020. And it is billed as a contemporary cool climate Australian Chardonnay. Further development in terms of ownership of the brand is that earlier this year, 2024, Pernod Ricard sold a raft of its wine brands from Australia, New Zealand and Spain to another group called Accolade. So we're still to see how that affects the fortunes of Orlando. Fruit for this wine came from 2 vineyards. 80% of it came from vineyards in Woodside, and this fruit evidently gives the wine richness and broadness. The remaining 20% come from a vineyard in the Piccadilly Valley, which evidently provides the wine with freshness and linear acidity. Now, in some ways this seems counterintuitive to me, because actually the vineyard in Woodside is noted as being planted with a clone of Chardonnay called Clone 95, and generally that produces quite citric, mineral, crisp, very focused Chardonnays, whereas the vineyard in the Piccadilly Valley is evidently planted with a clone called I10VI, or I106 I suppose, and that normally has a reputation for producing rich, tropical, ripe styles of Chardonnay that, if allowed to get too ripe, can actually be quite blousy. So the idea that the Piccadilly Valley fruit is providing the freshness and the linear acidity seems to go against the information I have for the planting of the clones in these vineyards. I don't know about the Piccadilly vineyard, but the vineyard in Woodside evidently are planted at an altitude of 400 metres above sea level. The vines there are 16 years old, so relatively mature, not perhaps quite not at full root extension, but certainly a site that's cooled by its altitude and that will have good airflow off the Mount Lofty ranges. The fruit for this wine was harvested on March the 23rd, and 85% of it was hand-picked, so a very small proportion being machine-picked there. Generally, the vineyards of the Adelaide Hills are relatively steep and therefore they're not particularly suitable for machine harvesting. The fruit was whole bunch pressed and that gives lovely clean juice. It then fermented and aged in French oak barrels. Now 80% of these were new and they were a combination of 70% of puncheons, so larger barrels, with 30% of hogsheads. After fermentation in barrel, the wine then went on to age there for a further 9 months. A portion of the malolactic conversion was blocked. In other words, to retain a portion of crisp, tart malic acid, just to give the wine a little more freshness, and an extended period of batonnage, so stirring up those lees inside the barrel was practiced. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? To start with, that's a medium yellow colour. The wine has 13.1% alcohol, the notes say. It only says 13% on the alcohol, but that's a rounding thing. Swirling it, it is not particularly viscous. It's very slowly starting to form tears, only just really. You know, it's not particularly clinging to the glass there. So let's see what we'll make of the aromas, shall we? The aromas have a nice intensity. There's a rich tropical fruit. There is sort of a ripe peach and nectarine stone fruit. There are tropical notes. At the same time, there's a degree of creaminess from the lees aging. And then over the top of that, standing out a little, not perfectly integrated, you have some notes of vanilla and cedar coming from the oak. And in fact, there are some quite toasty notes of that oak at the end there, with some little sort of touches of gunpowder, those sort of complex stony notes from fermentation. There is a lot going on the nose. There really are plenty of very classic barrel fermented Chardonnay aromas. So let's have a taste. On the palate, the wine is dry. It's relatively full. It only has just over 13% alcohol, but there really is a breadth across the back of the tongue there. And rather than the alcohol, that will be the lees aging. And the creaminess from the lees is necessary to stop the oak from standing out too much, because there are some quite strong cedary, vanilla, and I suppose cinnamon spice notes coming through the fruit there. But for that sort of lovely creaminess sort of helping to tie it in and integrate it, that would stand out quite starkly. But actually the lees aging is sort of pulling it in quite a bit. Yeah, there's a roundness, and the fruit starts off as sort of quite delicate, peachy stone fruit, but actually builds quite well to the finish. And there's quite a ripe, almost sort of tropical towards mango sort of note at the finish there. And yet at the same time there is some mineral crispness on the acidity. Maybe that's that sort of touch of malic acidity that's been left there, giving us sort of a mineral and quite citric note. Actually right down the middle of my tongue there, which is bizarre because normally I'd expect to feel that sort of mouth-watering sensation on the edges of the tongue, but it really is sort of right at the back in the middle of my tongue there. And the acidity is lifting this citric note and giving the wine some quite good length. There really is a breadth and an opulence that's been built by some quite ripe fruit, plentiful new oak, and a creaminess that's sort of tying it all together. And yet at the same time, there is length, there's a good freshness and some nice elegance there. I think it's a wine that probably needs a year or so to settle down, just to allow the oak notes to settle a little and integrate a little more. I mean, the barrel fermentation has left them fairly well integrated, but they are quite powerful, they're quite to the fore, and they could do with just sort of coming into balance with the fruit to come out from behind them a little. I guess really the wine is medium to full bodied. While it's not a massively ripe alcoholic style of Chardonnay, it does have good power and intensity, and I think that combination of intensity and fresh acidity should allow it to age, certainly for 5 years and possibly up to the 10 years that the winemakers suggest it would be capable of on the back label. Looking at the Wine Searcher aggregated critic score for this vintage of this wine, this has a score of 92 out of 100. I think that's a pretty reasonable score. Possibly it's a score that projects how good it's going to be in the future. Certainly this is a wine that's won medals and trophies as well. I think it's a wine with an interesting combination of richness and elegance. I think it's one that you might be quite pleased to have in your cellar, because I think it's going to develop quite nicely, certainly in the midterm. I for one have been quite interested to try the wines now being sold as Orlando, because I think there does seem to be a real focus both on the quality of the wines and their ability to reflect their origins. Yet the wines are not as expensive as many in their class. So thank you so much for joining us. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, please do press the like button. If you'd like to watch more of these tastings, it would be fantastic if you'd consider signing up and subscribing to our YouTube channel. We'd really appreciate your support there. If you have any comments, please pop those in the comments box below. We'd love to hear what you think about the wines we're looking at, the tastings we're doing, or anything else that relates to these. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, do please feel free to pass it on to them. We'd very much appreciate that acknowledgement from you. I will leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, and there you can see any production information we have, background to the producer, we have an entry on the grape variety, on the region. You can compare vintages, you can look at price history, you can see what the critics have to say, and you can see any awards and medals that it's won, and you can see how other users rate the wine. So hopefully there's plenty of information there to help you make an informed decision about perhaps purchasing some of Orlando's wines. So thank you once again for joining us, and I do hope you'll be able to find some time and come and join us for another tasting in the very near future. Thanks again. Bye for now.